Above all the virtues we as humans value, courage is one of the most admirable. Once defined by Ernest Hemingway, it is grace under pressure. It is having the will to stand up for something when all odds are against you. In this film are the stories of 8 great United States senators who under pressured circumstances risked their political careers, their popularity, reputations, and even their principles to stand up for what they believed is right and true. One of these men who showed exceptional political courage is John Quincy Adams, a former U.S. President, Senator, and Governor of Massachusetts. During his time, a few decades after the Revolutionary War, there was much controversy between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists over many political issues. His father, John Adams, who had served as President of the United States previously, had been a Federalist, and he was one of the founding fathers of the Constitution. John Quincy Adams, however, did not bind himself to either political party, but rather stood strong in his Puritan beliefs and would not let his party or colleagues sway his beliefs. He had a very non-partisan, non-sectional approach to all topics, and because of this, he became politically isolated. For instance, in 1807, he, who said he was Federalist, supported legislature like Jefferson's Embargo Act, the Louisiana Purchase, and the Monroe Doctrine, which were all big anti-Federalist legislatures. Because of this, Republicans hated him, Democrats hated him, Federalists and Anti-Federalists both hated him. However, he stood strong to his beliefs, not caring if he was crossing political borders in his decisions. People called him disloyal and unfaithful to his party and his constituents. Adams, however, ignored this and continued this act of political courage until eventually he was elected as a politically independent president of the United States. Later in his life, when he decided to retire hopelessly from his political career, he was asked by the voters of the Plymouth district to represent them in Congress. He accepted their offer and was elected with a surprisingly overwhelming vote because of his previous political courage and independence, and he served in the House of Representatives until his death. About this election, he said, "I am a member-elect of the 22nd Congress. No election or appointment conferred upon me ever gave me so much pleasure. My election as President of the United States was not half most gratifying to my inmost soul." The Civil War. The bloodiest, most horrific war in American history that changed the world to how it is today. Great crises produce great men and great deeds of courage. This country has known no greater crisis than that which culminated the Great War between the North and the South in 1861. While much dispute and strife went on preceding the Civil War, there were a few great senators who did all they could to maintain the Union and compromised all they had to keep the country from dividing. On the blizzardly night of January 21st, 1850, a man named Henry Clay, the writer of the Missouri Compromise, made his way through the snowdrifts to the home of Daniel Webster. He had a plan to save the Union, and he knew that he must have the support of the North's most renowned orator and statesman. He had a plan of a new compromise that only one man could deliver to the people. Daniel Webster was considered one of the most talented figures in our congressional history. He had a great ability to make alive and supreme the sense of allness, of union, that all Americans felt, but few could express. Clay unfolded his plan for compromise that night, which included California being admitted as a free state, and New Mexico and Utah as unbiased states. The slave trade would be demolished in Washington, D.C., but a more strict Fugitive Slave Act would be placed, making it harder for states to escape to freedom. Because he was a very extreme abolitionist, this compromise was a sacrifice he was willing to make for the union of his country. By presenting this speech, he also sacrificed his chance of being elected for another term in Congress, as his compromise would be frowned upon by many people. In his last letter to the Senate, he wrote, "I shall stand by the Union, with absolute disregard of personal consequences." What are personal consequences in comparison with the good or evil which may befall a great country in a crisis like this? Let the consequences be what they will, I am careless. No man can suffer too much, and no man can fall too soon, if he suffer or if he fall in the defense of the liberties and constitution of his country. There was also another senator who during this time of civil war also stood up against his foes in an act of political courage to maintain the Union and stop civil war. Thomas Hart Benton, the first senator ever to serve 30 consecutive years in the Senate, was a Southern man from Missouri. He was very sharp-tongued and never lost a debate in his life. Although he had views favoring the South, his first commitment, he felt, was to the Union. When he refused to allow the secession of his state from the Union, the Southern political leader John C. Calhoun said to him, "I suppose the senator from Missouri, representing a slave-holding state, would have supported these resolutions." He replied, "I shall be found in the right place on the side of my country in the Union." From then on, he refused to go to any senatorial meetings concerning secession, and eventually, people noticed this, and many people disowned him and called him a traitor, but he still stood his ground. He would support the union of the country, not division of it. The next election, he was defeated and not elected senator. This did not stop him, though. He still got up and gave more speeches, all the way through his old age until his throat would bleed from talking too much. Eventually, he was elected again in 1856, in a burst of popularity from his speeches. He died a few years later, still hard at work, saying, "I am comfortable, I am content." Even in death and defeat, he was victorious, as his voice was one of the factors that prevented Missouri from seceding along with her sister slave states. Yet another senator, Sam Houston, the first founder of the state of Texas, the first president of the independent Republic of Texas, and a member of Congress representing Texas in the Senate, was a firm believer in the unity of the United States. He also was a Southern man who was Southern by birth, loyalty, residence, and philosophy. His whole life he had believed that the country was formed as one country and that it must never be separated. In 1854, a bill came to Congress, the Kansas-Nebraska Bill, which would repeal the Missouri Compromise, therefore bringing a civil war to the country. Senator Sam Houston would not stand for that, so he stood up and spoke. He said, "Our children are either to live in the enjoyment of peace, of harmony and prosperity, or the alternative remains for them of anarchy, discord, and civil brawl. We can avert the last. I can trust we shall. I adjure you to regard the contract once made to harmonize and preserve this union. Maintain the Missouri Compromise. Stir not up agitation. Give us peace." About this speech, he said, "It was the most unpopular decision I have ever made," he said, "but the wisest and the most patriotic." Many years later, after being called a traitor by all his fellow congressmen, he said in one of his speeches, "I ask not the defeat of sectionalism by sectionalism, but by nationality." These are no new sentiments to me. I uttered them in the American Senate in 1856. I utter them now. I was denounced then as a traitor. I am denounced now. Be it so. Men who never endured the privation, the toil, the peril that I have for my country, call me a traitor because I am willing to yield obedience to the Constitution and to the constituted authorities. Let them suffer what I have for this Union, and they will feel it entwining so closely around their hearts that it will be like snapping the cords of life to give it up. What are those people who call me a traitor? Are they those who march under the national flag and are ready to defend it? That is my banner, and so long as it waves proudly over me, even as it has waved amid stormy scenes where these men were not, I can forget that I am called a traitor. After the Civil War had passed, there was still much struggle on political grounds between the northern states and the southern states, and the Senate became very weak in representing constituents and were now mostly speaking for businesses just to get money. The Reconstruction program that Lincoln had planned before he was shot was happening very slowly, if not at all. The legislative branch and the executive branch were constantly fighting for power, and neither would compromise to pass any legislature. The Congress would propose legislature that was unfair to the South. President Andrew Johnson would veto them as unconstitutional, then the Congress would overturn his vetoes. However, during this time, there were two senators who wanted the Senate to be fair and who stood up against the overturning of President Johnson's vetoes. These men were Edmund G. Ross and Lucius Lamar. Edmund Ross was a senator from Kansas who had very conservative morals. He believed, however, against the beliefs of his party, that President Johnson was not guilty of the charges of impeachment that were filed against him in 1867. Because of his decision to do what was right, he lost his political and personal popularity. The next election for Senate, he lost his bid for re-election. He was burned in effigy and accused of idiocy by the press. Before he died, he told a friend, I became a judge acting on my own responsibility and accountable only to my own conscience and my Maker, and no power could force me to decide on such a case contrary to my convictions, whether that party was composed of my friends or my enemies. Lucius Lamar was a Democrat senator from Mississippi whom as a freshman representative stood up in Congress to give a eulogy upon the death of Charles Sumner. Charles Sumner was a northern man from Massachusetts, an abolitionist. Many of the congressmen there hated Sumner and thought Lamar was a traitor for giving this eulogy. Lamar ignored them, and he spoke about how Sumner had a desire for unity between the North and the South. Later on, Lamar was elected as a senator, and once again he acted in opposition to his party by agreeing to the findings of an election commission that gave the presidency to a Republican candidate, Rutherford Hayes. He kept his senator seat, although many hated him because he would cross party boundaries just to do what is right and true and good for the nation. Our next politically courageous senator, George Norris, was a Republican man from Nebraska. During his time, Woodrow Wilson was president. In January 1917, Woodrow Wilson had asked Congress to authorize him to arm American merchant ships, although America was still neutral in the war at that point. Although Wilson's request was agreed upon by the public, George Norris and his fellow senator, Robert Lafayette, stood up and disagreed with the issue. They felt Wilson's bill was a ruse by big business to get the United States into the war. So Wilson and Lafayette filibustered the bill and kept it from passing. However, Wilson then stated that executive power had already allowed him to do that. Norris went to the people of Nebraska and spoke to them about these issues. He got no response from them, but he was elected to the Senate the next year anyway. Although the United States still joined the war and the ships were armed, Norris was a man with integrity and political courage, who stood up against something he believed was wrong. Robert A. Taft, a very conservative senator of Ohio, was a man who always wanted to be president. Although he never achieved that goal, he was a man who stuck fast to the principles in which he believed. Taft spoke to Congress about the Nuremberg war crimes trials that were happening at that time in the late 1940s. To Taft, the defendants were being tried under ex post facto laws, meaning the laws were made after they committed the crimes, and they were being accused for them. The defendants were architects of a Nazi regime, and they were sentenced to death for waging a war of aggression. Taft felt that the Constitution put limits on ex post facto laws so that our country would not just punish people like these men out of vengeance. His voice was heard many years later, and the Supreme Court ruled that the Nuremberg trials were unconstitutional use of ex post facto laws. In this film, you've seen and heard about 8 great United States senators who stood up against things they believed were wrong, and they fought for what they believed was right and true. About political courage, John F. Kennedy says, "To be courageous, these stories make clear, requires no exceptional qualifications, no magic formula, no special combination of time, place, and circumstance. It is an opportunity that is sooner or later presented to us all. Politics merely furnishes one area in which imposes the special test of courage. In whatever arena of life one may meet the challenge of courage, whatever may be the sacrifices he faces, if he follows his conscience, the loss of his friends, his fortune, his contentment, even the esteem of his fellow men. Each man must decide for himself the course he will follow. The stories of past courage can define that agreement. They can teach, they can offer hope, they can provide inspiration, but they cannot supply courage itself. For this, each man must look into his own soul."